Welcome, and thanks for joining us. Each week, the Stanford Graduate Program in Journalism invites an industry professional to speak about the state of the journalism industry, past, present, and future. And each week, we bring you the story. Welcome, and thanks for joining us. Each week, the Stanford Graduate Program in Journalism invites an industry professional to speak about the state of the journalism industry, past, present, and future. And each week, we bring you the story.
Good.
Cool.
Okay.
Go for it.
Well, we're thrilled to be here. It's really an honor to be with you, and I hope you ask us really difficult questions. I've had a lot of different types of jobs in journalism, mostly at legacy newspaper companies, I would say. But I went to journalism school myself. I started writing for a newspaper when I was 15 years old, and worked in journalism all the way up until 2 years ago. This job at the D.school is my first job not in journalism since I was 14, and I worked at Chick-fil-A. So it's a little bit strange. So it's always fun to be back with sort of the family. So I'm happy to be here and happy to answer any questions about, particularly about like career path and development and how technology has changed things. I got to work a lot with RB and with Emi on that at the Post. And so ready to go.
Yeah, I'll just echo everything Justin said. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I'm really excited to be here. I've not been a Knight Fellow, so it's really cool to see like the inner sanctum of like journalism and learning. So thank you guys so much. Just to give a little bit more of my background, I've worked in probably every medium except radio, and even then I've gone to NPR and played around with the fun stuff they've got going on there. So if you have questions about that, I'm happy to riff. But yeah, fire away, please. Looking forward to the difficult stuff.
Well, we were just going to start off with, the word design is thrown around a lot. What exactly is meant when you say design?
Oh, okay. Well, my background is I actually studied to become a reporter. I started out at a small newspaper where I'd go out and cover events, and I'd come back and lay out the paper in Quark Express. I don't imagine any of you learn Quark anymore. Okay, there you go. Cool.
In Cambodia.
In Cambodia. Okay, good. So when I was getting ready to leave there, I applied for jobs around the country as a reporter, and nobody wanted to hire me as a reporter. There was a paper in Greensboro, North Carolina, who said, "Did you write these headlines and design these pages?" And that's how I became a designer, was on the job, and I learned a lot at Poynter and other places, and got deep into the golden rectangle and all sorts of things like that around graphic design. So my background traditionally is what we'd call big D design, which is like graphic design or web design or industrial design or product design or things like that. At the D school, the reason it's lowercase is because we don't teach big D design. A lot of the people who are on staff there come from design backgrounds. Our creative director comes from Hollywood and spent a lot of time as a filmmaker, and I was, a designer as well. But we primarily teach design methodology to people who are non-designers. So because the D-School is a place where, it's the only place on campus where grad students come together from all the different programs. That's really what makes it uniquely special. We're mostly teaching people who don't have design backgrounds. So I think the definition of design right now is pretty broad. But there's a real difference between people who are expert designers, big D designers, and people who are using design methodology to make change in the world.
Yeah, I see hands, so I'll let that stand.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in like the process of design thinking. I know that's a very like D-school-esque term. And curious about how that relates to journalism and the process of like story finding. I was talking to, I know a couple of the Knight Fellows are taking D.school classes.
Right.
And a couple of them have some really interesting insights as to like how design thinking has helped them change the way they approach stories.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, and two of your colleagues here in our boot camp class. Sorry, you want to go first on some of these?
Yeah, no, go for it. I mean, I would say the design thinking thing, that's all you. I can follow up on that one just because I'm sort of in it. Yeah. Yeah,
so there's a lot of ways to go about it. I'll tell you a story because I think you guys will identify with this. So when I became the digital design director at the Post, it was really to build out that digital design team. I had never done a wireframe, and so it was a little bit uncomfortable for me to be in charge of that team, even though I wasn't a traditional web designer. But it happened when the Post website and newspaper merged into one company, and luckily I had people on the team who really knew what they were doing. So my job really was to sort of build out how we worked, not the expertise of what we were doing, and how to build collaborative teams in the newsroom to create new experiences online. And so I spent a lot of my time walking around and making friends with people in order to help facilitate how people could recognize the different expertises that are necessary to create the best type of storytelling, and really get people to feel like, you know, if they opened up about what they were working on, that we could create something better together than they could on their own. And so when the iPad came out, just a little anecdote, when the iPad came out, so we had a business development model at the Post at the time that was a waterfall model. So if you wanted to create a new digital product, you surveyed the landscape, you made the case for what you were going to do, and then new resources would be assigned to that. All the resources are limited, right? So particularly tech resources at the time. So we would make the case for the idea of the creative idea of what we thought the Washington Post iPad app should be, and then people would get assigned to the team and we would start working on it. The difficulty with that model was that, you know, I'm sure you guys have experienced if you're throwing out a creative idea and there's 10 people in the room, if 9 people love it but one person says, let me just play devil's advocate for a minute, right? It kills the idea. So it's hard to create a risk-taking culture in a model like that. And so I had read about the D.school and about how, again, it's multidisciplinary collaborative teams, and because you're prototyping all the time, you're also always testing back with who your users are, and in brainstorming in particular, we focus just on creative ideas, and the #1 rule of brainstorming is to defer all judgment. So, so I think, you know, any time that you're talking about journalists working together, right? The way that you can create a non-hierarchical landscape where each of the individual specialists can share their expertise without sort of bigfooting the process, that's what's special about it. So for instance, like, you know, I would always try to get, the great thing about being a designer in a newsroom is, like, I was really dependent on everyone else's work. So, you know, the relationships I built with editors and the trust I built with them about them sharing stories with us earlier on meant that we could get a head start on what we were going to contribute to the process. And the mindset around that, I think, is that, you know, you want to be as good at what you do as everyone else is at what they do. And so at a place at the Post, if you're working with, you know, Dana Priest on a project, it's an incredible challenge to be as good of a designer as she is as an investigative reporter, right? But that's basically what we try to do. And so case by case, you know, working with people who are skeptical about these multidisciplinary teams, they start to see people who have these different specialties as resources. So I know I'm rambling a lot here, but like in the case of Dana, who's a real hero of mine and 2-time Pulitzer winner, right? When we worked on a project together called Top Secret America, she was working primarily with a database engineer, interactive graphics designer, a UX designer, you know, her editors and another reporter, but it was very multidisciplinary. And I think that's a part of how we approach design thinking at the D.school that directly applies.
I'd like to offer a flip side to that, actually, because when I started at the Post, I started in politics, and so I started on one of those sort of multidisciplinary teams. I was like on the web team, and Justin, you were very much instrumental in sort of allowing for this type of environment to grow. But right after Justin left, actually, I went to a model where I was my team. So it was me, a columnist who was based out here in California, a blogger who was based in New York. So I didn't necessarily have the multidisciplinariness that I had when I was in politics. So I actually saw the Post sort of evolve into a different type of organization where individuals were called on to sort of be the masters of their silo, where it was like, run an entire section on your own. Let's see how far you get. Let's see how much content you can produce within sort of you as a single actor, perhaps managing other part-time actors. I didn't actually participate in a lot of those big projects where it was like, you've got a database engineer, you've got a designer, you've got, you know, a whole team of people who are each bringing their individual skill to play, because once I tried to do that, it was like, no, you're supposed to work alone. You're supposed to be able to marshal enough resources to produce the content you need to produce in order to keep your section going, to keep your content flowing. And whenever I did try to bring in a designer, it was like, wait, no, we need that person for, let's say, the NSA story, or we need them for something bigger. So I sort of worked in an entirely different environment. So what I'm seeing are news organizations leveraging both of those types of models, where how much can we get out of one person alone versus how much can we get out of a team, and when is it right to use those models based on the types of stories you're trying to tell, or the types of products ultimately you're trying to create. So
just wanted to make a side note, which is that Mr. Ferrell referenced his iPad user interface. There is actually a video of him explaining it, linked on the 291 website.
And has a question.
Ferrell.
Yes.
So you're really talking about organizational change.
Yeah.
Right. And one of the it's interesting how you're talking about, you know, building teams and then also building these sort of stars, right?
Right.
Because we've seen whether it's Nate Silver,
Right.
who sort of came out of this,
Right.
or
Ezra Klein.
Yeah.
or Andrew Ross Sorkin, you know, sort of bubble up and bubble out.
Right. Chris Cillizza.
So
Yeah.
my question is, do you see
Yes, Chris.
is it somehow backfiring? Is there risks there? Did you lose your best talent by cultivating your best talent?
Probably need somebody from the New York Times in terms of Nate Silver to answer that one.
I was with the New York Times.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, what Emi's saying, there's tons of different models going on in newsrooms right now, and there's not like one model for all. I worked really hard to sort of get out of being, you know, tied to a desk for a certain number of hours every day, so that I would have the freedom of movement to make these connections. Now, the connections that I was facilitating had to produce something in order for me to continue to have that type of day-to-day, but that was the way that I felt like I could contribute the most. There are people who are, you know, just have the talent flowing out of their fingers, and you want them to be producing content, right? I mean, content is king. So I spent a lot of my time in figuring out how to distribute content and new models, and how do we work with the business side, and what are we going to charge for it, and things like that, because that's an area of need that I think journalists' ideas need to get in there, and there's not a clear avenue for that, partly, you know, because of the firewall that we've traditionally had, but I really think digital is blowing that up. And I'm a huge proponent of journalists as entrepreneurs, and I think that a lot of the ideas about, you know, how to pay for our journalism, that there are people in newsrooms worldwide who have great ideas about that, and often are just not asked. And so I was trying to build my last time there was trying to build those relationships without jeopardizing the credibility of the content.
I would follow up and say that, yes, I think that there is a star model emerging, and it's been doing so over, you know, a very long period of time. I'd say it's born very much out of the columnist model. I mean, you know, you have people that people generally read. That's always sort of been the case. I think Justin's absolutely right that digital is blowing up that model, that it's really sort of expanding it. It's sort of mushrooming, if you will. And I think that there are really wonderful things in that you get great content, and then those people then become talent scouts. So if you look at Wonk Blog, which used to be called just Ezra Klein, it's now an entire ecosystem of amazing writers. So I think that's a wonderful thing to come out of that. You have strong talent from Ezra, which then acquires resources, which generates revenue, which allows him to then hire wonderful writers and create something that is even bigger than he could ever create on his own. Thank you. And I would say the same is true for Chris Cillizza. If you look at Chris's team, it used to be just Chris Cillizza. It used to be just him manning the fix. Now he's created, you know, an amazing, amazing writer and editor out of Rachel Weiner, who is now funneled into local. She's now doing amazing things out of local. So he's creating these people, these stars are creating opportunities for more people to come in to cultivate their skills. And I wouldn't be surprised if you started seeing the bylines in these products expand out to become their own bylines, become their own products. And then you just have people cultivating very specific voices and skills and opportunities to then expand the field and create models as entrepreneurs. Yeah.
Cool. Yes.
I think that it's very lucky that the Washington Post has a lot of these resources and they want to invest in something like this.
Sure.
And I haven't been at a ton of newsrooms, but in the few that I have been at, it's like they want to see some of these changes being made and they're very open to new ideas, but they don't necessarily have the resources for that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any advice on how to, I don't know, I guess jumpstart these processes and maybe
I struggled with the resource issue when I was at the Post even. I would say that never assume that large news organizations have these incredible resources. They're funneling into everything. There are actually people in the newsroom doing a lot with like literally like duct tapes and shoestrings. And usually when you want to start something wonderful, that's all you've got. Like Justin was saying, it's like you have to come up with an idea, make sure nobody shoots it down, and then they're like, okay, here's some resources, good luck with that. And that's them guarding what they have and the resources they need to funnel into things that they know will be successful. So I would say, and this, you probably learn a lot of this coming out of the D.school, rapid prototype. Like really just sort of say, I don't need a lot to make manifest in some way, shape, or form this idea that I have, because like Justin said, content is king. If your content is amazing, no one can fight it, nobody can poke holes in it, it just is wonderful. And so I would say focus on the resources that you have, and they're really more locked up in here than you probably realize.
Yeah, I would also say that just from being here, right, there's a real conflict in my mind, or tension in that, newsrooms would say that they don't have resources to do things, but there's so many stories of people here that were solo founders or two people who created a company that's now worth $1 billion, right? So some of it has to do with choosing what you're not going to do anymore and what you are going to do now, and it's redirecting those resources. Now the difficulty I think for community organizations is that sometimes those decisions mean that they're not doing the public service that they're meant to do, right? So it's hard to have somebody not cover a city council meeting because they're working on the local news app, right? So I recognize that those are really difficult decisions, but a lot of newsrooms have a lot more people than a lot of the startups that you see around the valley, and so it's really about how do you make those pointed decisions.
And also about attitude, the attitude of the people in the room and which attitudes you endorse over the ones that you don't. I came into journalism in a very unconventional way. I didn't go to J-school. I didn't do any of the conventional things. I started working in television, went to web, went to print, went back to web. It was the whole thing. And when I finally landed at the Post, I just sort of had this hodgepodge of experience that I put together. And what I realized is there are people who really think journalism is one thing, that it is writing a great story. I think journalism is not just writing a great story, it's taping a great story, it's, tweeting a great story. And so I think it's about the attitudes you endorse. Do you allow somebody to exist with this mindset of this is the only way great journalism can exist? Or do you try to change that mindset? Or do you just endorse the mindset of other people? So I think it's not even about the raw resources that you have in terms of the human capital, but which capital you decide to sort of accentuate, prioritize, endorse, carrot stick approach, if you will, over other mindsets and other approaches. So it's, as I said, locked up in here, accessing that resource and figuring out how to, I hate to use this word, but how to manipulate it in a way, I think is probably one of the most powerful tools you'll have.
So after the Washington Post was acquired by Jeff Bezos, there were some columnists and media people out there writing prescriptive pieces and what he should do with the Washington Post.
I think I wrote one too. I wrote some analysis piece on the great thing about Bezos being patient with long-term projects and everybody was writing about it.
Everyone became Prime members.
Your strategy recommendation would be then for design then, and not only in the Washington Post newsroom but newsrooms in general.
For design of
if you were to write a letter right now to Jeff Bezos, what would you say about what should be going on with design in the future?
I might have to do that in March.
I see. Wow, that's good. Good question. Well, first of all, I think this is a really interesting trend that the technology, the tech leaders investing in journalism, and I think like Piero Midyar's project is going to be really interesting to watch too. same amount of money, right? But he's going at a different way. You know, to me, the best thing about Bezos buying the Post is that it becomes a private company again. And that means that there's no stockholders that they have to answer to, and there's no quarterly reports. I mean, there's whatever he decides. But, you know, from the way I understand it, it's 1% of his personal wealth. And so if he wants to give the Post leeway to experiment with things, then he will. I think that experimentation is really important. And actually, the Post, in terms of how design has become more central to the company, is, I'm not sure what they would do differently. I'm actually super proud of where they are. So when we started the digital design team, there were 3 people. And this was, what, 4 years ago, maybe? And now there are, you know, multitudes of people, not tons, but more than a dozen. And there's different teams that have broken off of that. There's mobile designers there now that weren't there before. There's programmers in the newsroom now that weren't there before. The woman who was the deputy, one of the 3 people when we started this team, now reports directly to the managing editor for digital. So there's people in leadership positions there who are design experts in these jobs and in these titles and positions that didn't exist just a couple of years ago. So the trend, if you want to call it that, is, I think, really powerful. I think it has to continue. The challenge there is for it to not be a threat to the people who are delivering the great stories. So one thing I always told teams that I managed was, be a resource, not a threat. Right? It's not about, on a micro level, if you go to a reporter and you say, give me your story so I can put bells and whistles on it and change it around and tell you have to cut 6 inches, like, they're not going to want to give you that story. Right? But if you approach it as, wow, what you do is really amazing, and I want what I do to mash up with what you do so we create something really awesome, and then you deliver that in your first interaction with them, then they come back to you. Right? And that's essentially what I got to do, which was awesome. So then I got to work with all these great reporters and editors on all these big stories because they needed a designer, right? You got to have a designer. So sort of approaching things in that way. So I think, you know, you're always going to need new skill sets. I think the people who are in those design leadership positions at the Post need to continue to look at what do they need next. For a while, we had all these sort of unicorns on our team, right? So, and basically, like, here's the way things would happen, right? So they happen I think, based on relationships, and then in a micro way. So the D-school, we would call this rough prototyping, and then, but you prototype in a way that it can generate larger scale changes, right? And the change, you know, before you know it, a couple of years later, you have, you know, dozens of people. Right? But the point is, you got to get started. And if you went right away to the bosses and said, I need a dozen people, and by the way, they're going to know how to do, you know, this type of programming, and the person you're talking to doesn't even know what programming is, they would just say no, right? So you start wherever you can. You try to create that wedge, and then you hire people and you do projects that everyone else sees, and then they're like, how can we do more of that? And you say, oh, well, then we need more resources. So you prove yourself along the way. But one small example of this is when we were doing that Top Secret America project, right, which was, for me, the most recent thing I did in a newsroom. It was a really complicated story, and it was about all the private contractors in this country who are doing top secret level work for the government. It's a very important, fascinating story. It was built off a database. Well, it was hard to get into right away, and so we sort of had this idea of, like, how can we introduce the broad context of this before people start reading all the things that we've produced and going through the maps and going through all the data and stuff like that. And so we had this idea for, like, what does a movie trailer look like for a journalism story? And so we started with that, and we created this movie trailer type thing that gave the context to it, and I was the producer for that. Well, I've never been a video producer before, so it's not as good as it could be. Jerry, don't don't hit me too hard.
Oh, that's not bad.
Oh, there you go.
Let's start somewhere.
But what we needed was, we needed an animator to pull together some of the visuals and with, you know, the other pieces of content, the interviews and stuff. Well, we didn't have an animator. So we got a little bit of money and from the newsroom, from Raju, who was Raju Narasetti was managing editor at the time. And we hired somebody to do the animation part. Well, the video, I mean, on the strength of the story and how the government, you know, right before it came out, like sent an internal email around to everybody saying like, watch out for this story that got leaked, you know, so there's tons of attention when it published. The video had 400,000 page views the first day. It was set a record for the post. So now people wanted to know, like, how can we do more of this animation? So suddenly, now, off the money that we had gotten to hire an outside person to do it, I could make the case that we should hire an internal person to do it. And then it was a matter of finding the right person. So we hired a guy named Sohail Al-Jamea, who's a fantastic motion designer. And he works with the graphics team. He came over from ABC News, and he was doing, you know, on-screen graphics for things like, you know, quotes in the background and the Meet the Press logo and stuff like that. And he really wanted to have more time to do in-depth explanatory journalism. And we have used his skills time and time and time again in so many different ways. I don't know if they have any more motion designers now, but that's how you bring in these new skill sets. So it's not enough for the designers to be great at what they do and for you to have a lot of people who are doing those types of things. It's really incumbent on the design leaders, I think, at the Post to continue to look for these new skills that can be used in the process of storytelling or whatever it is they're trying to do, and make the case and try these experiments to bring in new people with new skills, integrate them with the journalists that they need to work with, right, so that they can create something better together than they could on their own. That's the mantra, right, and continue to grow that out. That was a really long answer.
I would say also, I mean, I'm on leave for a year, so technically I will have to make my appeal, you know, come the spring, like, you know, what's happening at the Post, and I'll really have to look carefully at the company and my own skill development. If I were to write a letter right now, I would say, first of all, thank you, Jeff, for buying the Washington Post. You know, I think he provides a lot of opportunities for growth, but I would say probably the most important thing to focus on is professional development. I think that news organizations have a wonderful opportunity, and I think somebody asked the question, how do you retain digital talent? But they have a wonderful opportunity to get a number of different people with a variety of backgrounds to come and advance the art, the craft, the business of storytelling and of news reporting. And I would say making sure that the people in that newsroom are up to speed with being as skilled as they possibly can be or want to be in particular areas outside of their own inherent discipline that they bring is probably one of the most important things. When I was at the Post, one of the things that I really appreciated the most was that we switched our back end while I was there. We moved from a sort of hodgepodge system of back ends to a singular back end. Was learning that system, was really having the time to focus on and learn that system. It was an incredibly valuable skill. It allowed me to then create a vertical. So being able to have that time to be able to expand my skill set, I would love to hang out with Sohail for like a week. If the Post could afford for me to do that, that would be remarkable. I mean, I have some video editing skill, but not a lot. But if he could just sort of give me the little tools that I needed, then maybe that could advance my skill, and I could actually augment the work that I'm doing and take some of the load off his plate. I also loved working with the digital folks that Justin brought on board, learning more about WordPress, learning more about the tools that I can use to tell stories. I think if everyone is given an opening and an opportunity for that kind of learning in a really, you know, disciplined and discreet fashion, if that is what the resources can provide, I think the storytelling opportunities will explode, just absolutely explode in the newsroom. So that would be my request for a focus in terms of what you do next with the Washington Post and with the resources that he stands to bear on the company and the organization as a whole. Cool.
So I know you guys were intrigued by some of the questions on the list.
Yeah.
You're welcome to draw from there if you'd like to. As well.
I'd love to take this first one. The Griot quoted me as saying, "Economic inequality is the defining issue of our time." Yeah, thank you. I love people who bring my old quotes out back at me. It reminds me that the internet is the universal medium. Do I believe there are things we can do to be a part of the necessary change through our work? Absolutely. I think that there is an opportunity to be a part of that change if news organizations make a concerted effort to pay their young talent. That is where it starts, is making sure that that a newsroom does not rely on free labor either by virtue of college credit, university credit. It doesn't rely on people who can afford to work in newsrooms. It should pay for its talent. And I think that to me is that movement has sort of started over the course of this year, not just in the news business and Hollywood and a variety of industries where you're beginning to see the more resources that you or your parents have, the more of an opportunity you have in journalism. I think that's a mistake. It leads to a myopia. It leads to a lack of diversity in storytelling. And I think that bringing people in, paying people for the work they do, because, I mean, I've seen the numbers. Pre-roll sells for pretty good money. Banner ads probably not as much, but bringing people in with a diverse set of skills, regardless of their socioeconomic background, that's the most important thing. If you can get through school, you should be able to get into a newsroom, and people should pay you to bring those skills to bear. So,
I like the question about how would you inspire young coders and designers to come work in a newsroom. So, I worked with several people on this at the Post, and the main thing is the mission. You know, so when we were hiring programmers into the newsroom, it's a very small set of people who identified as journalists and also had really strong programming chops. And some of them, a lot of schools are starting to have more of those types of programs in graduate schools, but I went to Northwestern, so the shout out for Northwestern here. So they had this grad program that they sort of pioneered that was for programmers, and they learned journalism in a year. And Brian Boyer was the first graduate of that, and he was the news apps leader at the Chicago Tribune, and now he's at NPR, and more of these people with those types of skill sets are coming out. But when we were hiring at the Post, there weren't a whole lot. And the main thing was, you know, we realized that we were competing with not our traditional competitors. We were in a salary review one time for one of the guys that we hired, who's a fantastic designer and programmer. And the discussion among the executives was about, we got to make sure that we take care of this person because we don't want the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or somebody else to come in and get them. And I sort of raised my hand and said, you know, actually, that's not really who we should be worried about. We should be worried about Silicon Valley, right? And I think that's true. But the difference is that when you're passionate about journalism and the people you get to work with, then it's the way that you communicate that to the people that you're trying to bring into the fold. I mean, just whatever people's skill sets are, it's like that passion has to be one of your priorities. And so I never felt like I was selling anything to hire somebody to say, come work on this project that is important to the future of national security in this country, or come work on this project that is about, you know, how we talk about how election districts are drawn up. You know, come work on this project about the financial crisis and credit default swaps and the reason why, you know, the economy is in the tank in this country. Like, those things are real. Those things are very important, right? And so you can always, if you find the people who believe in the value of giving that public service, and they have these different skill sets, that's who you want anyway. And that's how I always sort of expressed it. You could go work for a company that's, you know, trying to maximize the number of page views they get for advertising, or you can come here and tell stories that are going to help people with their lives, right? We'll always have that. Other questions? Yeah.
So a lot of news websites have sort of the recommended for you bar, and a lot of the times that recommendation bar is not necessarily the most important stories. It's more based on advertising. So how...
I love this question.
At the Post, how do you ensure that the content that you find that's most important is actually read by your readers?
I actually have this debate with my mother all the time, who's a print subscriber. And she always tells me the reason I'm a print subscriber is because I get to peel through the paper. It's a predictable, medium for me to go through, and I can see all of the stories laid out. If I want to take this page and put it above, A1 and compare it, she can do that. She can highlight, circle. She can interact with it better than she can interact online. And she always says she feels that what she sees on the homepage isn't necessarily anything that she would want to read, but that it's hard for her to then flip the page and then see a whole nother slate of things, of a diversity and of a highly curated type of experience that she's used to in print. So it's a huge challenge in terms of translating those two experiences. So that recommended box becomes very important. Now, the recommended box, in terms of what's recommended for you, is built off an algorithm, so the more you use it, the more precise it gets, obviously. But you have to get people over that hurdle of getting them to actually use it. So that's an initial challenge. Once they do, making sure the algorithm actually is strong enough so that the more you don't have to use it as much in order to start getting really relevant results. So that's a tech issue. It's based on advertising a little bit, but I would also say it's based on what people want to read. Often we get the complaint, I'm seeing stories that aren't important. Like, for example, I'm not seeing this NSA story in my recommended reading list or as the most popular thing, to read, although given that headline, it probably is at this point. But they always get this, really sort of irrelevant, as they like to call it, content. But what a lot of people don't realize, and what I like to tell people very often, part of the new journalism, the new world, is readers get to vote. Their clicks are votes. And many people think that, this is controlled by advertising and being surfaced this because an advertiser, paid for it. And in some respects, they're right. There is an ad model if you're working in a for-profit, news medium. But when you click on something, when you say, I want to read this, or I'm interested in that, you're voting for that thing. You're saying, okay, this thing is worthy. And so I think part of what will make news better and journalism better in this particular arena is making readers more aware of the power they have on the stories that get surfaced to them. And I think that's starting to happen, but I'm surprised by how many people I talk to who read the print product and say, I love the print product, I don't like the web product because I'm getting all of this irrelevant stuff. They don't realize, well, if I click on the relevant stuff, or if I make just that little bit of effort to find the relevant stuff, I can really help change my reading experience and the reading experience of other people. So that democratization of surfacing of content is something that I think is going to become incredibly important over time. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Cool.
Emil, did you have one?
Yeah, I have one. Kind of going back to what you were saying earlier about the necessity of paying young journalists for their work. Do you think that ethos is going to develop, or does it exist yet? Do you think that it's something we should just hope for?
That's a good topic for this room. They like that.
Yeah, I like that.
Who wants to get paid?
Yeah.
Can I just interject? Did you guys read the op-ed piece in Sunday's New York Times on this issue? Okay. If not, I'll circulate it. It's eloquent.
It's good.
Okay.
To answer your question, can the ethos develop? I think it already is. I think news organizations they're already starting to get dinged for it. It's hard to hold power accountable when you are having people work for you for what is essentially free, and it's also becoming it's a bad story. I mean, at the end of the day, a news organization is beholden unto a company, whether it be held privately by Jeff Bezos or publicly if it were owned by the Washington Post company. News organizations don't like bad stories about them. Just like every other company and every other organization, they want to be fair. And so this is not a good story, and it's not fair. So it's, I think the ethos is developing, and I think it's developing quickly, but I will also say the speed of change is dependent on how ardently young journalists ask to be paid. So for every journalist who goes in and says, oh, don't worry about it, you don't have to pay me, that's just one more log on the fire of, okay, I guess we don't have to pay young people. Whereas if all young journalists walked in and said, no, actually, I really do want to get paid, and I'm not talking like union advocacy or anything like that, however you feel about unions or not, but for every young journalist who walks into the room and says, I'd love to do this for you, but unfortunately, since you're not paying me, I really can't, I got to go to this other job that will, that starts to put another log on a different fire that says, if we really want this content, if we want, to be able to sell advertising against this stuff, we have to pay these people, which is why writing for free is very costly. It's far more costly than I think people realize. So companies like news organizations that stand to make a profit on advertising against content, they make money when you write for them, and so call them on that, and I think that's only fair. So I think the ethos is, it's a two-part system. Young people have to insist on it, and news organizations have to realize that that insistence is rooted in something real and something relevant, and that it ties to their bottom line.
So we have about 5 minutes left. We can take one more question, or if you guys have some closing remarks you'd like to make.
Oh, I love questions.
Questions?
Yeah.
Anyone have a really good one to end
over
on?
here.
Joel does.
You were talking about convincing older people like your mother to go online. But isn't it still true that newspapers make 80% of their revenue from the print product?
Absolutely. Yeah, the print product is still a very, very valuable component of the business model. But I will say, as the population of news consumers changes, I don't see that percentage going up unless the product is considered a highly, highly exclusive and very, very expensive product. So it really depends on how news organizations decide to handle the pricing around that product. But I will say that the sort of the opportunities on the web to make money through video, for news organizations, excuse me, to make money through video. If you look at the Post, they launched Post TV not too long ago, to make advertising revenue and pre-roll for that video. That opportunity to sort of make money on a number of different types of content on the web platform, that opportunity is just a little too rich to ignore with an aging population around the print product.
That's true. The only problem is that people don't like web ads. They're afraid of them.
Yeah, exactly. And yes, that is a huge barrier. I would say one of the organizations I'm most intrigued by in that, targeting that fear or that dislike is media. I'm really curious to see what they do and how they monetize that product. I think that will, if it is successful, could trickle into more traditional news organizations, perhaps.
Other question?
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having
us.
This was great. We'll wander over to the D.school, which is like right behind our building.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. We could talk about these things all day.
All day long. Yeah.
There's so much.